Hey VCers, Matt here. Hope everybody's having a good weekend. Happy day after the 4th of July to all the stateside VCers, and happy July 5th to all the VC members elsewhere in the world. Hope you all are doing well. Wanted to check in and wanted to continue with my series of reviewing Kinks albums. Real quick, I finally got off my lazy butt and changed out the shelf of records. The soul albums have been tucked away, and I pulled out this band, these four guys from England with the funny haircuts. Not a bad band. Maybe I'll do some reviews of their albums one of these days. But for now, let's stick with a British band that actually is grossly overlooked and does need some attention. Moving on with the Kinks, and I've been reviewing the Kinks albums in order of release. We are up to well, we'll get to that in a second, because I realized that there's two of them that I forgot to mention while I was doing my reviews. 1965, A Greatest Hits album came out in America. Actually went to number 9, so it was one of their highest charting albums in America. And it had all the 64 and 65 hits, as you'd expect. You Really Got Me, Till the End of the Day, Tired of Waiting for you, All Day and All of the Night, all that stuff. So it's a good little album. I don't have that one, or I'd show it to you. But and since then, of course, there's been dozens and dozens of Kinks greatest hits and compilation albums, but that was the first one to come out. The other one, 1967 album that came out, I'd have to double check the date. I think it actually came out after this one, something else by the Kinks, which I reviewed last time, but it was called The Live Kinks in America. Everywhere else in the world, England, Europe, and elsewhere, it was called The Kinks Live at Kelvin Hall. It's taken from a couple of concerts that they played in Scotland that were taped, I think late 1966 concerts. The two different names of the album, but it's the same material on either one, so it really doesn't matter. I prefer the American cover to the English and to the Kelvin Hall cover, that is. But it's a fun little album. There was the Rolling Stones Got Live If You Want It that came out around that time. Of course, there's the Beatles at the Hollywood Bowl, which didn't come out till a decade or so later. But it's British beat band and screaming girls, and You Really Got Me and all the hits. They do the Batman theme because that TV show was out and popular at that time. They have the audience sing Happy Birthday to Peter Quaife, the bass player, and a lot of energy, a lot of fun. So it's a neat little neat little live album, which is not entirely live because they went in the studio and kind of spruce things up and sweeten the tapes afterwards, which is not unheard of for live albums in those days and even into the 70s, so that's no big deal. But it's a fun one if you can find it. I used to have it, I no longer do, so I can't show it to you, but we are not here to talk about either of those today. I just want to make sure that I mention those since I was going in order of releases. We come today to the third of what I consider the Kinks' golden run, or maybe the fifth if we want to conclude controversy, and that's a good enough album to really include. So in that case, it would be the fourth of that run. But anyway, we come to my second favorite album of all time. The Kinks are the Village Green Preservation Society. No surprise probably that on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to rate this a 10, so you don't have to sit around till the end of the video to on the edge of your seat if you're wondering what I was going to give it. So this is the album too that really got me into the Kinks. This came out in 1968. Funny date, probably not funny to anyone but me, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But came out in 1968. I bought this album. I used to have it on vinyl. Unfortunately, no longer do. So all I can show you is the CD. Got it in 1980. I was 16 at the time. And the Kinks were one of those. By 1980, I was well into, had been for several years, into the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Who, a lot of other bands. Kinks I was aware of. I've talked about this on several other videos as far as I'd heard You Really Got Me, Until the End of the Day, and those songs that everyone had heard. I heard Lola. And I knew of them, but didn't really pay much attention to them. I remember seeing their records in the record store and thinking from time to time, maybe I need to pick up a Kinks record and see what these guys are about. One I remember seeing most was the Greatest Hits album that I just talked about, the one that came out in '65. That was in record stores a lot back in the late '70s, early '80s. Anyway, so 1980, I walk into Sound Warehouse and there's brand new Kinks album, double live album, One for the Road, and for some reason caught my attention, and I thought, hey, I'm going to pick that up. Time to get into the Kinks, I guess. So I picked it up, and I quite liked that album at the time, and we'll get to that when we get time to review that. But at the same time, I picked that up, and I don't know if it was the same exact day. I think it may have been. Might have been a few days later. New issue of Cream magazine comes out, which I used to buy back then. Cream and Trouser Press and rock and roll magazines. This is September 1980 issue, and I didn't buy it for Bob Seger. I bought it all the time anyway. But career retrospective of the Kinks, which has an article where the guy goes through all their albums and talks about them. So he's talking about all these albums, including, well, all their albums, of course, but up to that point, including this, which he calls possibly the greatest album ever made. And he says it's an album that's probably 100 years out of its time, one way or another, and so forth and so on. And just from the way that he described it, I thought, man, I gotta go see what this is about, because I'd never heard of this thing at that point. I just knew you really got me in some of that stuff. So I went, and within the next few days, I went back to the record store, and they had a copy, and I picked it up, and it just was love at first listen. And that's when I really, really got into the Kinks. I'd been playing the One for the Road double live album for the whatever week or so between having that and getting this, and I enjoyed it, and it was a good record, but it was nothing compared to this. So anyway, Kinks of the Village Green Preservation Society came out in 1968, as I said. And this, to me, it's hard for me to speak objectively about this album because I just love the thing so much, and it's been my second favorite album since 1980 when I got it. And there are albums, I don't know if I can explain this coherently, because watching my videos, I don't know if I really explain anything coherently most of the time, but there are albums that you really like, that you think are great, that you love, and then there are albums and songs as well, and movies and books, but there are albums that are just over and above, just something special, just speak to you, that as soon as you hear them, they're going to be something you're going to, for the rest of your life, going to be part of you, part of your DNA, whatever. So, and this is one of them. It's just a quick example. 1999 by Prince came out. I thought it was a good album. It started showing up songs on MTV. I liked it. I thought it was a great album. Purple Rain the next year came out, or 2 years later. Purple Rain is one of those special great albums. 1999 is a great album. It's a good album, but Purple Rain's kind of, but I'm getting off the track here. So this album, the Beatles albums are like that, but the Beatles are so all-encompassing and in our DNA and so much a part of so many of us that it's kind of hard to remember that they're like that because we're so overly familiar with them. Even though I still listen to the Beatles all the time and love them, it's hard to sometimes remember that initial, when they grabbed hold of you, first heard them and stuff. So the Beatles albums are certainly like that. But there's a lot of good albums, but they're not necessarily in that vein, if I'm making a lick of sense here. Some other albums that would fall into that category would be Piper at the Gates of Dawn, the first Pink Floyd album with Syd Barrett. Between the Buttons by the Rolling Stones for me would be one. Sound Effects by the Jam, and this. So and it's not just that they're good and they're great albums and that you love them. It's that they are just a wholly realized, unique universe onto themselves that is just comes out of left field, and it's like nothing you've ever heard before, and it just seems obvious and wonderful, and they just grab hold of you and they speak to you and they become part of you. And I don't know that I'm explaining this well at all, probably not, but this is one of those type of albums. So there we go, and that made not a lick of sense, I'm sure. The album date of release has always been an interesting date in my life. This album was released November 22nd, 1968, which, for whatever reason, that date has special meaning to me, or it seems to show up a lot. Girl the great love of my life that I was supposed to marry, she was born November 22nd, 1965, which is of interest to absolutely nobody but myself. November 22nd, 1963, John Kennedy, of course, was assassinated, which I was 2 months old at the time, so I didn't realize it at the time, but that's always been a important thing in my life, I guess. November 22nd, 1963. This came out as well, and November 22nd, 1968, and November 22nd, 1968. This album with a whack cover by an obscure British band came out as well. So, I don't know. That's probably boring as hell for everyone out there. So, let's get to the album. This was, like I said, their 1968 album. Has a very dense, long, and convoluted genesis and story behind how this album came to be. I'll try to quickly run through some of that. You could actually write a book about it, and a matter of fact, somebody has. This came out in 2004, part of the 33 and a third series. If you haven't heard of the 33 and a third series, people write about different albums, and there's 30 or 40 of these books on all different albums out. This was one of the first. This was number 4. They're numbered, so this was among the first to come out anyway, by a guy named Andy Miller. Fun reading. This album, like I said, came out in 1968. Ray Davies started work, more or less, on the record in 1966. In between that time, which by that time Face to Face had already come out, so after Face to Face he kind of started work on this. In between that, this album came out, so he was writing songs for this that were never really meant for this. But started in 1966. One of the first songs he wrote, and like I said, it's convoluted because if you read interviews with Dave Davies, he said this is what happened. You read Ray interviews, this is what happened. You read Pete Quaife or Mick Avery interviews or their managers' interviews, and they all contradict, so it's kind of hard to pin down exactly what. There's a song on here called The Village Green Preservation Society, first song on the album. There's also a song on here called Village Green. Kind of confusing, but they're two separate songs. But basically it seems that the first song of this that Ray wrote was Village Green, which kind of gave him an idea to do an album where the songs loosely were connected by theme or concept, or is it a rock opera? We'll get into that in a minute. But that kind of started things off. So he starts working on the album, and at some point he writes the songs for this album, which is a totally different thing and not connected, so never mind that, and I told you it gets confusing. So 66 to 68, he writes a whole bunch of songs, and at some point, because at this point they have their band, they still can't play America, they're still making hit singles in England, and in fact they have a number 1 and a number 4, and then Dave Davies has Death of a Clown, which is released as a solo single, even though it's on a Kinks album, and it's really the Kinks playing, so it's just the Kinks with Dave singing lead, but it's called the solo single, and it's released as a Kinks single, and so it's really confusing, but that's a big hit in England. None of this does anything in America because they've been banned since 1965, and after Sunday Afternoon, they're largely forgotten, and I told you this is confusing, so try to keep up or don't. But go watch something else if I'm rambling here, which I probably am. So Dave's writing songs for this. He wrote the songs for this, and they released it. And Dave had a hit with Dave had a hit with Death of a Clown. There's talk of maybe Dave should do a solo album. So Dave starts writing songs for a solo album. Some of those songs, the solo album never happens, unfortunately, but songs are written. Some of those songs come out on subsequent Kinks albums and on B-sides and A-sides of Kinks 45s. Some of them are called Dave Davies 45s, some of them are called Kinks 45s. They're all pretty good. None of them are as good as Death of a Clown, which is the best of the lot, so far as we know. But the others that are released, the Dave Davies songs, are good stuff. But then there's the album never happens, and there's songs that were recorded that have never seen the light of day to this day. Some of them were released, like I said, farmed out on 45s and so forth, and some of them have been bootlegged, but some of the tracks have never been bootlegged or officially released, and they're probably sitting in Dave's closet or long since lost, or who knows. And if they're still around, and if you happen to watch this, Dave Davies, maybe Record Store Day is about 9 months away, maybe put those together and finally release it, and that would be cool. So what does that have to do with this? Well, just to show that the Kinks are in the flurry of activity in 66 to 68, and they're still doing concerts in between trying to write songs. Ray's being pressured by Pie. That's the other thing. The Kinks are on Pie label in England and Reprise or Reprise in America. Pie is, I guess, a cheapskate label, so they're not given what the Beatles at EMI, where they can, by this point, by 66, 67, 68, the Beatles have George Martin to help them out and help them develop their ideas. They have the freedom to record when they want to, as long as they want to, and Capitol Records or EMI in England is more than happy to spend money and let them do what they want, given that the Beatles have sold a gazillion trillion records. Kinks, of course, have sold a lot of records in England, but nothing like the Beatles. So Pie is kind of a cheapskate label. They rush them in the studio, get something, and rush them out, when that's even more amazing given the conditions that the Kinks had to work under, that they make these 5 as near perfect as you can get albums under those conditions, with not having a lot of time in the studio and not having a label that'll spend money on them and not having a label that really promotes them. And their manager and their label want Ray to keep cranking out hit singles. They don't really care about albums, even though we've had Revolver and Sgt. Pepper and Jimi Hendrix and The Doors and San Francisco and concept albums, and now it's not all about singles like it was in 64 and 65. It's about artist visions and the album and all that, and Pie doesn't care. They want You Really Got Me Part 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and that's what they're wanting Ray Davies to do. And Ray Davies is not wanting to do that, and he's starting to crack under the pressure because he's kind of a depressed and delicate soul to begin with, unlike his brother Dave, who's out there running around and drinking and bopping girls left and right and so forth. He's the extrovert, Ray's the introvert, and there's that whole brother dynamic, and the band is fighting like cats and dogs and makes Oasis look like the Gilmore Girls. But anyway, I'm getting off track again. So all that's going on. They're wanting hit singles from Ray. Ray's wanting to make more mature, introspective music, albums that kind of thematic concepts running through them, take time to get things right. You Really Really Got Me was great, but that was at this point 3 or 4 years earlier, and he's wanting to, like the Rolling Stones and the Who and the Beatles and everyone else, he's wanting to move on to more sophisticated art or statements, I guess, instead of just cranking out hit singles. So there's some talk around this time, around 67ish, that maybe Ray will not tour with the band, that he will stay home and write songs for the singles and the records and send the band out to tour, which is kind of what was discussed with Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys back in America. And there's a whole thing of Brian, and they're sort of similar souls, Wilson and Ray Davies, because Brian Wilson, of course, had his whole crack up after the Smile album, and that's a whole other story for another day. But Ray didn't end up leaving the band or stop touring with the band. He kept touring, but when they had to go out on tour because they needed money, that took him away from being able to work on records, so forth and so on. So in the middle of this, he's writing songs. To make things even more complicated. Well, first, this started out to be a Kinks album. Then it's like, well, maybe it can be a Ray Davies solo album. The thought being that Ray can, because the management, which was adding more pressure to Ray, was saying, you keep on cranking out those hits for the Kinks, all of You Really Got Me, or Till the End of the Day, or Sunny Afternoon, and in your spare time, you go over here and work on your concept album, and we'll see what we can do. You know, we'll get you some kind of deal for a solo album or something. So it was going to be a Ray Davies solo album, because these songs are really personal, Ray has said over and over. But then eventually that fell apart, and it was, okay, this is going to be a Kinks album. So to make things even more complicated, Ray Davies, like John and Paul early on, had written songs for the Beatles, but they also wrote some songs that they gave away for other artists, Peter and Gordon and so forth, that did some World Without Love and some of that, you know, just to supplement their income, I guess. And Ray Davies had done that. Some songs he wrote early in 64, 65 that other bands or singers covered. So around about 67, BBC TV, I guess, British TV, there's going to be a couple of special TV shows that are just a TV show of a stage play. I don't remember exactly what they were. I think there were a couple of them. They come to Ray. They want Ray to write some songs for these TV specials. So in addition to working on this and some new Kinks 45s in between all that, and then Dave's running around, maybe going to do a solo album, maybe not, who knows, and that doesn't happen, and maybe this is going to be Ray's solo album, but turns out to be a Kinks album eventually. But anyway, he's writing songs for these TV show specials. So those get done. Some of those songs the Kinks record, and there's some question on whether any of those songs were ever meant to be on this or not, and it depends on who you ask whether they were or they weren't. Some of them definitely weren't. They were meant for the TV show. Some of them don't get recorded by the Kinks. They get recorded by female singers because they're going to be part of the soundtrack to these TV show specials. And some of the songs got written and recorded or demoed or who knows, because they've never seen the light of day. And whether those were ever meant to be Kinks songs or just for that special, it's anybody's guess. And so some of them have never been released to this day, and some of them, the tapes have probably been erased, so they're probably lost forever, unfortunately. So you got all this craziness going on, and Ray keeps working on this album, and it gets more complicated. So he keeps writing songs. Starts off with the Village Green song, which gives him a loose idea of what he wants to do, but he's still not exactly sure. So he writes more songs, and some of them fit into the concept of what he wants to do, and some of them really don't. So they get kind of set aside, and he's still not sure, and he keeps writing songs, and he finally kind of forms the concept slowly but surely. So the record company's yelling for more singles because they want to keep making money off the Kinks. So they put out a single that is called Wonder Boy, and this is in the middle of the run where the Kinks, there's pressure, but their albums are perfect, from Controversy, Face to Face, Something Else, this one, and Village Green, and Arthur, the one that follows, and we'll talk about Arthur in the next video. But hit the lamp there, sorry. So they put out a single, Wonder Boy, which is not a bad song. It's a good song, but it's not as good as the stuff they've been putting out the last couple of years, and it's not as good as the stuff on this. And it flops. I mean, it doesn't do anything in America because they're banned in America, and America's basically forgotten that they existed. 99% of the people over there, and they're thought of as at all. It's that oldies band that did "You Really Got Me" 4 years ago or 3 years ago or whatever it was. So, but even in England, Wonder Boy flops. It's said to be John Lennon's favorite Kinks song. At least that's what Ray Davies says. But then he heard, somebody told him that John Lennon told him that it's his favorite song, and he heard it from a guy that John Lennon liked it. So whether that's true or not, who knows. Anyway, Wonder Boy is a very nice song, but it's not a great song, and it flopped. And so Ray Davies gets more depressed, keeps writing songs, and the record company's like, oh, this isn't selling, you're the Kinks over. So they get him, and he puts out another song called Days, D-A-Y-S. Brilliant, wonderful, beautiful song. Should have been on this album, and probably was considered to be on this album, but it's not. Days goes top 10 in England, sells a ton of, well, not as much as You Really Got Me, but sells a lot of copies. So they're doing okay. That buys them some time. Days later gets covered, I forget, late 70s, early 80s by Christy McCall, who even, and that's what most people remember the song as her, even though she didn't originally write it. The Kinks originally wrote it. Both versions are really good. I like the Kinks more than hers, but hers is great. Christy McCall is, of course, the girl who wrote and originally sang They Don't Know, which was a big hit by Tracy Ullman here in America in 1983, which most Americans think of it as a Tracy Ullman song, but it's actually Christy McCall, and Tracy Ullman did it, and then Lydia Lovelace just did it on her newest album. But I am off the track again. So Days comes out, it's a hit in England. Ray keeps working on this album. They're yelling for an album, the record label is. So singles and albums, I always want product back then, because it wasn't like it is now where people release an album every 4 or 5 years. Then you had to release an album or two every year, and you know, a single every season at least. So they want an album. So Ray gets to work on putting together a track listing for his album to be called For Well-Respected Gentlemen, which is a riff on the Kinks hit song from 1965, A Well-Respected Man, which was one of their first kind of socially conscious songs, as opposed to stuff like You Really Got Me and All Day and All of the Night, the boy meets girl type songs, moving more into commentary and a little more mature theme in their songwriting. But anyway, so four more respected gentlemen track list is put together. Some of the songs on that album would eventually end up on this album, but not all of them. And so the record label's ready to release that album, and then they don't, either because Ray convinces them not to, or they change their mind, or whatever. That album never gets released. There are some acetates pressed up for the album, but there's no sleeves or anything, and it never gets released. Those acetates, if they even still exist anymore, got to be worth a fortune. So the Four More Respected Gentlemen album doesn't come out, and Ray keeps working on this. So they are yelling for an album. Eventually he keeps writing, gets more and more songs. He's got a ton of songs. Said that he wrote like 20 songs in the first 2 or 3 months of 1968, which is probably incredible. I wouldn't know, I don't write songs, but it sounds like that's pretty impressive to me. So he gets this album, finally gets this album ready. It has 12 tracks and it's ready to go. And Pye is ready to release this album in September of 1968. But then September of 1968 comes and goes, and the album doesn't come out, except it kind of does, because Pye has the master tapes and the track listing that Ray Davies approved. So they send their master tapes to New Zealand, Italy, and 2 or 3 other countries in Europe, and maybe one in South America. I should have looked and I forgot. Those places released the album with the 12 tracks and with different, all 4 of those countries have different cover than this one, which is what it was in the U.S. and England. So those albums are long out of print and worth a fortune if you can find them. The 12-track. And the 12-track album, some of the songs that are on here are on that, and some aren't. Some of the songs on there didn't show up on here. So you got all these Village Green songs that didn't actually end up on Village Green, and some of the songs were just written around that time and probably never considered for inclusion on Village Green, and it's all confusing, like I said. Finally, Ray goes to Pye and says, well, now I want to make a double album. Pye doesn't say no. Pye says hell no. So they go back and forth, and finally they compromise and tell Ray, well, okay, instead of a 12-track album, you can make a 15-track album, which is what this ended up being, but you can't make a double album. So get your songs together and let's put this thing out. So Ray goes back to get his songs together, and then he decides, you know, I'm going to write some more songs. So he starts writing more songs. Anyway, finally, really submits this stuff in October of '68, and the album comes out November 22nd of 1968. And it's generally considered to be their best album, and it doesn't chart in America or England or anywhere else in the world for that matter. And in this magazine article in 1980, as of 1980, says that it has sold 32,000 copies in America in what was that, 12 years time at that point. Oddly enough, it since grew in cult status, and it is now their biggest selling album. Go figure. So I am at half an hour. I'm going to cut this and come back for a part 2. We'll talk about the album itself, and we will see you in a bit.